So you recall, just as a way of review, we said that all of the journeys of Paul, at least in the first journey, was right there in that little corner of the Mediterranean Sea. And they recall they go from Antioch, go to this little island of Cyprus, and back up into Asia, and they come back. That was the first journey. You remember that we said that there was a lot of wonderful things that occurred on the journey. A proconsul was converted in Acts chapter 15. Remember that, 13, I think. And we said that the proconsul was a governor, and he had a lot to lose, probably the equivalent of maybe Pilate. Pilate gave in to the crowd because of politics, and so to speak. Pagan priest is converted. You remember that in Lystra, the Apostle Paul converts a lot of folks, and they began to worship him. And a pagan priest offers sacrifices to Paul. But then, just as soon as that happens, the Jews come over and stir up things for Paul, and then he's stoned in Lystra. And I heard Ira Lynn say one time, he said, that's the equivalent of what it is to be a full-time preacher, right? One time they want to sacrifice to you, and the next time they want to stone you. And that's what he had. So we said that there was a lot of things that happened that weren't good along the way, that Satan used some non-believers. Remember Elymaeus before the proconsul? Also that Satan appealed to pride, that it was very easy for Paul to have given in to pride when they tried to worship him, that they used persecution when he was stoned. Satan used that and could have been successful at causing the halt of the preaching. And then Satan used false teaching. And you remember in Acts chapter 15, the big false doctrine was that in order to be saved, if you were a Gentile, meaning a non-Jew, you had to be circumcised. And it's very important that we keep all three of those in mind. It's the fact that they were a Gentile and not a Jew, and that he was binding circumcision on them, not Paul, but the Jewish teachers were, in order to be saved, not just as a matter of following it as a custom. And that was false teaching. And you remember at Acts 15, they got the council together at Jerusalem, and they had circulated a letter around to the churches and said, some people came out from our church, and they said you had to be circumcised to be saved. And we think that's wrong, and they circulated that. And it was an example to us of how to handle conflict and doctrinal discussions. So Satan, finally, the last thing that we noted was that he uses strife. So if you're in Acts 15, let's look at starting in verse 36. Now they completed their first journey, and now they're going to go on a second journey. And Paul and Barnabas talk about it, and they say, let's go back and let's encourage all the churches that we had planted. And so in 36 he said, sometime later Paul said to Barnabas, let us go back and visit the brothers in all the towns where we preach the word of the Lord and see how they are doing. Barnabas wanted to take John, also called Mark, with them, but Paul did not think it was wise to take him because he had deserted them in Pamphylia and did not continue the work with them in their work. That happened just as they left Cyprus. They got to Asia, and John Mark turns back. Verse 39, they had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company. Barnabas took Mark and sailed for Cyprus, but Paul took Silas and left, commended by the brothers to the grace of the Lord. He went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. Okay, so there's a lot in that verse. First of all, this is the first journey. And you remember, they left right at Antioch, went to Cyprus, went back around to Pamphylia, and this is where John Mark turns back. Paul continues with Barnabas, goes to Antioch, Iconium, Lystra, where he's stoned and left for dead. Derbe, he comes back, and then they go back to Antioch, and they give that report, right? So when, in verse 39, he says, they had such a sharp disagreement, they parted company. Barnabas took Mark and sailed for Cyprus. So Barnabas and Mark are kind of retracing the steps of the first journey. They're going back to Cyprus, okay? But notice he says, Paul chose Silas and left commended by the brothers to the grace of the Lord. Silas was one of the brothers from Jerusalem that we read about in verse 22 of 15. So instead of going the same way as Barnabas and Mark, he goes through the interior. So he's going to start right at Antioch, and he's going to go back up this way. So you think about it, they had a big fight. How awkward would it be? They're getting on the boat together. They're not talking, right? They're angry, and they're there together. That wouldn't work, would it? And I've seen that even in the church. People get angry, and they start parking on one side of the building, and the other people park on the other side of the building. You ever seen that? And then they come in, they don't see each other, they sort of pretend like, that they don't exist. That's exactly what happened. Paul, his second time when he took Silas, he said Antioch, and instead of going to the Cyprus Islands, he goes up to the interior of Asia, goes around. And so we're going to read exactly what he did. So let's look at chapter 16. He came to Derbe and then to Lystra. Remember, that's where he got stoned. So he goes back up the very place that they were trying to kill him at Lystra, right in there. Now, that took some guts, didn't it, to go back to the place that was trying to kill him. But he was at odds with Barnabas, and so they didn't go together. Okay, let's look at verse 2. Verse 1. He came to Derbe and then to Lystra, where a disciple named Timothy lived, whose mother was a Jewess and a believer. So that's important, right? She was a Jew, but a believer. So she had converted, apparently, to Christianity, or at least she believed, and his father was a Greek. The brothers at Lystra and Iconium spoke well of him. So he was well liked, right? He has a mother that's a Jew who's become a Christian now. He has a father that was a Greek. Now notice he says, Paul wanted to take him along on the journey, so he circumcised him because of the Jews who lived in that area, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. Okay, so a lot of times the Jewish rabbi or whatever, they would not circumcise a baby on the 7th or 8th day, I think, whatever it is, unless the father approved. And so if he is a Greek, he's not going to approve this, probably. And so that's why Timothy was not circumcised. But his mother was a believer, and he apparently is a believer. Paul likes him. He has a lot of character. A lot of people like him. So he wants to take him along. He'd be really fruitful for the work. But he is not a Jew. His mom was a Jew, but he is not a Jew. Now, one of the things we have said last time was that circumcision was not required for the Gentile to be saved. So I'm persuaded that in this instance, Timothy, had he chosen not to be circumcised, he was saved. If he had been immersed into Christ, if he was a Christian, he didn't have to be circumcised. All right, got something? Oh, okay. So, but he chooses to circumcise him. So the one thing I want us to see that we saw last time, and that is that Gentile Christians do not have to be circumcised to be saved. I think we pretty much hammered that home last time in chapter 15, in verse 5. Notice with me, just chapter 15 and verse 5, he says, Then some of the believers who belonged to the party of the Pharisees, so these are Christians, but they are part of the Pharisaical sect. They stood up and they said, the Gentiles must be circumcised and required to obey the law of Moses. So being a Christian wasn't enough according to them, right? You had to be a Jew also. And we said that was false teaching, and so they nipped that in the bud, so to speak. Galatians chapter 2, we read also, if you have your Bible there, put a marker right where you are, and let's go to Galatians chapter 2. Galatians chapter 2, and starting in verse 1 now, Galatians chapter 2, starting in verse 1. 14 years later, I went up, Paul speaking, I went up again to Jerusalem, this time with Barnabas. I took Titus along also. I went in response to a revelation and set the before them the gospel that I preached among the Gentiles. But I did this privately to those who seemed to be leaders, for fear that I was running or had run a race in vain. Yet not even Titus, who was with me, was compelled to be circumcised, even though he was a Greek. Okay, so he was a Gentile, and he was not compelled to be circumcised. So that is what I want us to see, is that for salvation, he did not have to be circumcised. Now, are there other reasons to do something than for your salvation? Yeah, what are some examples? I mean, what is one reason to do something? Okay, great thought. You have better influence on somebody if you make a decision to do some action, right? So in this case, Timothy was not circumcised, and he didn't have to be circumcised. But for expediency, you think about the prejudices of the Jews at that time. They all knew that his father was a Greek. And so this would hinder the gospel. This potentially could hinder the gospel, because they see Paul walking in with Timothy, and what do they say? I don't want to hear anymore, right? Because he's not even a Jew. You come in here and tell us about the gospel of Christ. You've got somebody that's not even of our sect here. Who are you to talk, right? So that it was not for salvation, but it was for expediency. Yes, sir. Yeah. Yes. Right. It's very similar to 15 verse 5, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah, he's not talking about, this would be a good thing or whatever. He's binding that in Galatians 2. So in order to say that, well, in later Paul's going to say in 1 Corinthians 7 that circumcision is nothing, right? And so we really don't have that as a rule to bind on anybody. But if we want to have a better influence, then it potentially could have been bad had Timothy refused to be circumcised. Now, it seems like he's a man of age now, and so he's making the decision. His father said no, apparently, when he was on the 8th day, but not now. And this removed a stumbling block that could be for the Jew. So the answer was no to circumcision for salvation, but yes to circumcision for expediency, right? To help in furthering the gospel. Okay, so I want to look at another thought here, that Jewish Christians did not necessarily have to abandon all of their Jewish customs just because they were Christians. Now we think that, and we think, oh, that can't be right because, they can't offer animal sacrifices. That's not for salvation. And again, we're not talking about salvation, are we? Salvation comes through Christ. And Paul would never say that the law was for salvation, would he? But we do have some examples of Paul doing things that tend to lend, in my opinion, that he was somewhat keeping some of the customs. Remember in Acts chapter 3, Peter and John, you remember they go up to the temple at the time of prayer. And I've always wondered, did they go up at the time of prayer to win souls away from Judaism? Or did they go up to the time of prayer because that's what they did? They prayed every day at 3. I mean, we don't know, right? They went in, and you remember he healed a man right before he went in, and then the man comes in with him, and it stirs up a lot of attention, right? So Jewish Christians didn't abandon necessarily that. Look at Acts chapter 18. Look with me at Acts chapter 18. I want to look at just a couple of pages over. I think this is still maybe in the second missionary journey still. But it is further along in the journey. Acts chapter 18, verse 18. Acts 18, verse 18. Paul stayed on in Corinth for some time. Then he left the brothers and sailed for Syria, accompanied by Priscilla and Aquila. Before he sailed, he had his hair cut off at Missionary because of a vow he had taken. Missionary is a little strong little bitty town outside of Corinth, right there, Century. So we started out and we were right about here in the discussion, but this is way on back when he goes to Corinth. And right about there, he cuts his hair off. So I want us to think just a minute, why would he do that? Look with me in Numbers chapter 6. Let's go to Numbers chapter 6. I want to read just a little bit about why he did that. Numbers chapter 6. It says he took a vow and then he cut his hair. Okay, so let's look at Numbers chapter 6, verse 1. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, if a man or a woman wants to make a special vow, a vow of separation to the Lord as a Nazirite, he must abstain from wine and other fermented drink, and must not drink vinegar made from wine or other fermented drink. He must not drink grape juice or eat grapes or raisins as long as he is a Nazirite. He must not eat anything that comes from the grapevine, not even the seeds or skins." Verse 5, during the entire period of his vow of separation, no razor may be used on his head. Okay, so let's drop down to verse 18. After this, it goes through some discussion of various sacrifices that have to be made. But in verse 18, he says, "Then at the entrance to the tent of meeting, the Nazirite must shave off the hair that he has dedicated. He is to take the hair and put it in the fire that is under the sacrifice of the fellowship offering." So the Nazirite vow started. It had a period of time when you couldn't drink any kind of alcohol. You had several sacrifices you had to make. And then you presented yourself to the priest and shaved your head. So I'm persuaded that that is exactly what Paul did. When he shaves his head because of this vow, that's from Numbers. That's not New Testament stuff, right? Now, Paul would never say that I'm saved by the Old Testament law. He would never say that the blood of goats and bulls can save, right? He was not obeying the law for salvation, but he was, I believe, obeying it out of a sense of tradition. Maybe those were things that were edifying to him. You know, he's going to talk about in Acts chapter Romans chapter 14, he's going to discuss how, one man considers a day holy and another man doesn't, right? So even though it wasn't required by the law of Moses, he had an option, I'm persuaded, to obey some of that if he wanted to, but not for salvation. Because to do so for salvation, you had to do it perfectly, and nobody could do that. Does anybody have a thought before we go back? Okay, sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. Right. Yeah. I think so.
I mean, the last day of the first day of the week, right?
Yeah. Kept doing it. Yeah, maybe so. Yeah. I feel like that there was we're in a period of transition, aren't we? This is not, just cut and dried. I mean, he has a period of, these people they're so used to this. They've been told it is required their whole lives. And a Jew could potentially feel guilty, if he didn't, even though he knew in his heart that it was okay not to, go on Sabbath day or whatever. I think it would not have been wrong. Yes, sir. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Peter, to be able to by his life,
Yes.
so it's not always as
Yeah, I think that's a great point. When Peter chooses to separate himself, I don't think he's doing that maliciously. I think there's something in his mind that says, oh, yeah, I'm not supposed to be doing this. But Paul says, no, you can. This is not right. You're excluding them. Paul also recognized the Jewish custom, I'm persuaded, as an example to some of others. Look at Acts 21. Acts 21. Let's look at verse 17, Acts 21 and verse 17. When we arrived, talking about Paul now, at Jerusalem. Now, what kind of city is Jerusalem? Jewish, okay. The next day, when we arrived at Jerusalem, the brothers received us warmly. So these are Jewish Christians now. The next day, Paul and the rest of us went to see James, and all the elders were present. Paul greeted them and reported in detail what God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. Verse 20, when they heard this, they praised God. And then they said to Paul, you see, brother, how many thousands of Jews have believed. Now, is that a good thing? Yeah, that's a wonderful thing. A lot of Jewish people are coming over to our side. Okay. And all of them are zealous for the law. Uh-oh. I got the law in here now. What happened? They didn't just immediately quit believing the law of Moses, did they? Verse 21, they have been informed that you teach all the Jews. This is so important. We're not talking about Gentiles here. He says that you teach all the Jews who live among you, the Gentiles, who would live among the Gentiles, to turn away from Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or to live according to our customs. What shall we do? They will certainly hear that you have come, and so do what we tell you. There are 4 men with us who have made a vow. There's the vow again. Take these men, join in their purification rites, and pay their expenses so that they can have their heads shaved. Then everybody will know there's no truth in the reports about you, but that you yourself are living in obedience to the law. As for the Gentile believers, okay, we've shifted gears now, right? We're talking about the Gentile now. We have written to them to our decision. They should abstain from food sacrificed to idols, from blood, from the meat of strangled animals, and sexual immorality. So we talked about that last week. All that blood, drinking blood, all of that was part of their pagan idol worship, wasn't it? And so he's going to tell them, everybody thinks that you've abandoned the law. Why don't you take this vow, and everybody will know that you still hold to the customs. And I think Paul would say, and it appears that he did, right? But if you were to say, Paul, we know you have to keep this in order to go to heaven, he wouldn't do that, would he? Salvation did not come through the law. This was a matter of influencing Jewish people to help them accept the gospel. If they rejected him because they thought that he was disturbing their whole belief system, there's a potential they would reject Jesus. This was not a matter of salvation. And my first thought is, why didn't Paul say, listen, you Jews, right? Timothy doesn't have to be circumcised, and I'm not taking a vow because I don't have to. The old law is gone, and I don't have to do that. Would he be scripturally accurate? Yeah, but what would happen to the message, do you think, probably? Yeah, turn them off.
And they are God's people.
That's
and
right.
they're the first ones. They know the scripture. They have the scripture.
That's right. Judgment, not salvation, in order to be an influence to someone, right? We don't start talking about instrumental music to somebody that came out of, some denominational church or whatever. We need to teach the truth first before we get into not matters of weightier matters of the law. Talking about issues, that's not where we start with someone. Now, after a person has matured and they understand the treasury and maybe why we do things we do, that's a discussion to have, Yes, sir. Yes. Right.
It's not- this- All right, let's talk about the tithing.
Yeah.
And the sixth day, don't follow it.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Hey, then it, I think,
True.
and, but it's our house, any, and you're excited to hear what they say, all of a sudden they just start bashing. And
Yeah.
like, tells-
Yeah. You remember when, was it, who went to David to tell him about his sin? Nathan. When Nathan went to David, if he had said, you know, he didn't do that, did he? He told him the story, and he got his emotion involved, and he thought, man, this is not just. And then he turned the table on him and told him, that's you, you know. The idea that we don't just hit somebody up with something until they're ready, you know. Yes, ma'am. Yes, yes, yes. Yeah, that's true. And I think the sin was they looked at those customs as for salvation, right? And so when his disciples go and they, you know, take some grain and eat it, man, they get on that because we don't work on the Sabbath. You know, come on. Do you have a thought? Yes, as a matter of fact, right now, Paul became all things to all men in matters of judgment, not matters of salvation, right? Paul's not going to get drunk so that the pagan will feel welcome, right? But he might do some things that we would think, well, Paul, that's not salvation issue. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, let's look at that. Okay, 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Let's start in verse 1. 1 Corinthians 9, starting in verse 1. Am I not, now he's defending his apostleship because they have said some pretty awful things about him. And so he's going to stand up for himself a little bit, not because of his own pride, but because of his apostleship. Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus, our Lord? Are you not the result of my work in the Lord? Even though I may not be an apostle to others, surely I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. This is my defense to those who sit in judgment on me. Don't we have the right to food and drink? Don't we have the right to take a believing wife along with us, as do other apostles and the Lord's brothers and Cephas? You remember Peter had a wife and he had a mother-in-law that Jesus healed. Verse 6, or is it only I and Barnabas who must work for a living? Who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard and does not eat of the grapes? Who tends the flock and does not drink the milk? So he's going along the lines of the idea that I have a right to support. I have a right as an apostle to be supported. But drop down to verse 15. But I have not used any of these rights. And I'm not writing this in the hope that you'll do such things for me. I would rather die than have anyone deprive me of this boast. Yet, when I preach the gospel, I cannot boast, for I am compelled to preach. Verse down 19. Though I am free and belong to no man, I make myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. To the Jews, I became like a Jew to win the Jews. Okay, wait just a minute. What does that mean? Becoming like a Jew. What was the hallmark of being a Jew? What made you a Jew? Circumcision, right? So if you've got this brother with you, he's not circumcised, you're going to speak to a bunch of Jews. Okay, he doesn't have to be circumcised to be saved, but will they accept the message? Maybe not. Let's get circumcision.
Well, he also has great lineage too,
Sure.
and Jews real big on that.
And there's a point where he'll itemize all of that, right? I was, circumcised on the 8th day, raised under Gamaliel and so forth. He itemizes all of his rights. Let's look at verse 20. To the Jews, I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law, I became like one under the law. Though I myself am under no law, I'm not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law, I became like not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law at that point meaning the law of Moses. 22, to the weak I became weak to win the weak. I have become all things to all men, so that by all possible means I might save some. I do all of this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessings. If you go up to New England, let's say, to do mission work, and the first thing you start doing is talking about how the Dallas Cowboys are better than anybody else up north, what does that do to the message, right? I mean, you zip that, don't you? You go cheer for the, whatever, Patriots, right? You don't do things that purposely hurt the gospel. And I've had more than one story told to me about missionaries that go overseas and they want to Americanize the gospel here, right? We have an invitation song and y'all don't have an invitation song. Well, we need to change that, right? we all have one cup. That's not going to work. We've got to have these little cups like everybody else. We sort of impose that. And Paul says, no, I become, in matters of judgment, I become just like who I'm speaking to. So that I can win them, right? And that there again, we're removing that stumbling block so that they will be saved and they'll be receptive to the gospel. Okay. Anybody have a thought before we finish? Yes, sir.
I want to break it.
Yeah.
I'm going to be the break that.
Yeah.
Because nobody can tell me I have to.
Right.
Get really rebellious.
Yeah.
And then we hurt.
Yeah.
On the other hand, look at us.
Yeah.
End up transgressing.
Yeah. Because you run someone off that's a good person that wants the gospel.
So, I mean, my only thought is, talk about our pivot with regard to the gospel.
Yeah. Sure.
Rather, Paul goes in, still does.
Right. I think that's the key. Yeah, I've been in congregations where every tradition was turned on its head because we don't want to be anything like the generation before us. And so, we do harm. People that have been there for 35 years and you just change everything up. Well, maybe that's not the wise thing for peace, right? Or, we have 3 songs and that's all we sing. And if you want a new song, we stone you outside the city gate, right? Right? Okay, I want to look at, now this is Acts chapter 16. Let's look at, so that takes care of his circumcision of Timothy. Now, I wanted to go down through Lydia's conversion, and then next week, Sunday, I've got you one more time, and we'll do Paul, the conversion of the jailer. But for now, let's just read, starting in verse 6. Paul and his companions traveled throughout the region of Phrygia. I had to look that up. Phrygia is how they say that. And Galatia, having been kept by the Holy Spirit from preaching the word in the province of Asia. So he's going along here. He's up here, and he's going to go, they want to go through Bithynia and Pontus, up through this area. But he gets to about here, and he can't go there. The Holy Spirit does not allow him. I don't know what that means, right? Did the Holy Spirit tell him not to go? He doesn't say, but he says we were prevented. When they came to the border of Mysia, they tried to enter Bithynia, but the Spirit of Jesus would not allow them to do so. So they passed by Mysia and went down to Troas. During the night, Paul had a vision of a man of Macedonia standing and begging him, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." After Paul had seen the vision, we got ready at once to leave for Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. So you often hear that called the Macedonian call, right? So Macedonia is right there. And so they're right about here, and he has this vision of a man saying, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." So they do that. They go to the Neapolis, which is along that way out. Verse 8, so they passed by Mysia and went down to Troas. Verse 10, after Paul had seen the vision, we got ready at once to leave for Macedonia. concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. From Troas, we set to the sea, sailed straight for Samothrace, and the next day to Neapolis. From there, we traveled to Philippi, a Roman colony, and a leading city of that district of Macedonia. What kind of colony? Roman. So what's not usually in a Roman colony? Synagogue, right. There's not a lot of Jews here, right? This is Rome territory. So, verse 12, we traveled to Philippi, a Roman colony, the leading city of the district of Macedonia. We stayed there several days. On the Sabbath, we went outside the city gate to the river, where we expected to find a place of prayer. Since they didn't have a lot of Jews there, they didn't have a synagogue, but a lot of times outside the city, they'd have a little spot to pray. We sat down and began to speak unto the women that had gathered there. On one of those listening was a woman named Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth from Thyatira, who was a worshiper of God. The Lord opened her heart to respond to Paul's message when she and the members of her household were baptized. She invited us home to her home. If you consider me a believer in the Lord, she said, come and stay at my house. And she persuaded us. So, probably a woman of means, anybody that dealt in purple, that was for wealthy folks, wasn't it? I think the dye required to make a purple linen was from some sea urchin of some kind, and you had to dive to get it, and one little crustacean was a little drop, I think. So, to have a purple linen, that's going to be a lot of diving, and kind of an expensive thing. So she's a woman of means, and she's converted. That's a beautiful story to me. Someone who, in the middle of Roman territory, there's no real God-fearing people, a lot of them maybe, and she's a person of faith, and Paul teaches her, and she's baptized. Anybody have a thought about any of this, whether we're talking about, the journey or converts?
Is that Troas pronouns. More than everything's talked about they. But Troas, it says we and us. Which
I didn't notice that.
Include that maybe it's Luke
Joins them?
joins them, and as part of their teaching group.
Somebody told me last week that he thinks that Luke joined them so that if he got stoned again, he'd have somebody to take care of him. I don't know who that was, but that makes sense. I need a doctor, right? Well, if y'all don't have anything else, I guess we're through. Thank you.